Big fat Greek Hispanic. They love us. We got them all like the bartenders and stuff.
There you go. Mr. Guy that was the life of the party. That was Hispanic and Greek all at once. It was.
The July 11th, 2024 meeting of the Mount Pleasant Planning Commission is now called to order. Ms. Hawidyko, would you please take roll call?
Commissioner Devaney? Absent. Commissioner Bell?
Here.
Commissioner Honig? Absent. Commissioner Irwin?
Here.
Commissioner Kingsworthy?
Here.
Commissioner Leash?
Here.
Commissioner Nicholas?
Here.
Commissioner Portman?
Here.
We have a quorum.
The first item on our agenda is the approval of the agenda.
Move to approve. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Second item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from the June 6, 2024 Planning Commission meeting.
We did not meet, Madam Chair.
We didn't?
Oh,
For the zone, for June 6th?
the Planning Commission?
Oh, Planning Commission, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I read zoning
okay.
on my,
It's coming soon.
apologize.
That's okay.
Move to approve minutes of June 6, 2024, regular meeting?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The next item on our agenda is the Zoning Board of Appeals report.
Madam Chair, we did not meet.
The next item on our agenda is the communications.
We did not receive any communications.
Wow.
The next item on our agenda is the public hearing for TC 2401, a proposed ordinance to amend Table 154.405.a of the zoning ordinance regarding building standards in commercial districts and related sections. Ms. Hawidyko, would you please introduce the item?
All right, so we're finally here for this public hearing. So the goal for this suite of zoning text amendments, so we have a few items in the draft text, is to allow greater design flexibility within CD4, general urban, and CD5 urban center character districts. This is an outcome of our initial conversations in the beginning of last year with zoning for economic opportunity, as well as several work sessions that we had at the Planning Commission meeting last year, and introduction happened just last month. So here you can see the 4 categories of changes that we are going to be amending as part of this text amendment. The first category is with frontage build-out rules, which basically mean that we do require at least 60% of the lot frontage to be occupied by a building. That the conversations that we had asked for more flexibility, especially in certain conditions when you need more site access and maneuver of vehicles, if you're looking at especially drive-through establishments, narrow lots that may not have enough width to accommodate a driveway or access connections, and then other design limitations depending upon the type of footprint that the use is going to be implementing. So for that, we would be allowing the 60% build-out rule to be reduced if the applicant meets certain conditions and comply with one of those limitations. We would also be clarifying the 60% build-out is only applicable to principal frontages. So that is a change that would ensure that corner sites can accommodate parking behind buildings, as opposed to have to provide the 60% of both frontages and then not being able to provide any parking on the premises, which would not work for especially Mission Street. Regulations governing, and then there's one more item regarding flexibility for projects to determine what is their principal frontage. We did have some residential developments that end up going to the Zoning Board of Appeals in the past year, or in the past few years, actually, that homes they needed to call basically their narrow frontage, their principal frontage, which was not within context in their neighborhoods. So they had to get a variance in order to provide the principal front door, principal entrance to the building in the correct frontage and apply all the principal frontage regulations to that. Based on those variance cases, as well as commercial developments that have similar restrictions. So on Mission Street, you often have the longer side of the lot facing Mission as opposed to the side street. And we wouldn't want the development to face the side street. We would want the development to face Mission Street. So the change here is to allow principal frontage to match where the address is located and where the principal entrance is located, and not be based on minimum lot widths, which is the current situation that we have in the text. The second item, regulations governing the interior of buildings, would be removing the existing 11-foot minimal ceiling height requirement. We still have ceiling maximums that are going to be capped, but we're going to be removing that minimum in order to allow properties to accommodate, lower costs for HVAC systems, or we have a case for the dentist office that it did not make sense to have high ceilings for the small spaces that they were providing with the offices. Replace the minimum 2-story requirement and minimum 25 height requirement with instead a minimum 24-foot height requirement. So again, we're not going to be requiring 2 stories, but we're still going to be requiring enough mass onto the street area to have that building closer to the street and achieving all the pedestrian-friendly goals that we have on the zoning ordinance and master plans. I have a note here in green, which since the introduction last month, there were a few questions from the Planning Commission and discussion about this topic. We were requiring 24-foot height requirement for the first 20 feet from the building facade, but due to that discussion, I understood that the Planning Commission was leaning towards more flexibility. So the change here is to require an overall height of 24, which could be accomplished through roof design, so you can have a steep roof that have the ridge line at 24 that would accomplish this minimum requirement, as well as what we call faux facades. So those kinds of older types of development that you see in many downtowns, you may have a roof in the back and then you have that facade at the front going a little bit further up. And also you could design buildings that have a portion of the building achieving that height at the frontage line and then kind of stepping back on the back. So that will accomplish all of that. Setback rules, we will be removing the 0-foot mandatory front setback for corner sites. That would allow for better access from vehicles when going from side streets onto major commercial corridors like Mission or Pickard. And then remove 24-foot maximum side setback requirement, which has been, it's a rule that asks you to centralize the building, but sometimes depending on the configuration of the side flow, it does not work. So we're going to be removing that as well, and that is only going to be applicable to sites other than sites within downtown. In downtown, we're still going to keep those requirements, as it does help downtown areas that we have small building footprints achieve that continuous frontage, which is very prominent within context in downtown areas. An additional item that the Planning Commission was interested in approving as well is to change the administrative dimensional waiver from 5% to 10%, just to allow staff a little bit more flexibility in approving developments in case we are deviating just a little bit from dimensional requirements. So I'm just going to flip very quickly through the same illustrations that I've shown to you in the introduction. So we have here one mixed-use building that's in the works on the left. They have a setback that's further than or greater than 24 feet, and that, those changes would accomplish allowing something like this to be built. On the right, you have a drive-through establishment that wanted to come into this site on Mission Street, and they did not want to rebuild the whole parking lot. This amendment would also allow reuse and retrofit of existing sites without adding too much cost onto development. These two illustrations here on your left, you have a commercial building with a 24-foot height at frontage, but then you have the actual roof pitch reaching that 24, and it's hidden behind that wall around the building perimeter. That's the kind of accommodation that we'll be allowing moving forward. And then with the removal of the 24-foot side setback, we would also be allowing things like open door, recreation areas or open seating like you see here in this illustration. Parking would still only be allowed in the third lot layer, which is represented here in this illustration on the left. The illustration on the right shows a building that has the 24-foot maximum or minimum height at frontage, but then it goes down on the back, so that would be able to be accomplished. And we also would allow a certain 60% bid-out rule to be reduced. In this case, I'm showing a narrow site that needed that accommodation due to the drive-through configuration needing 2 exit lanes. This is the last illustration showing a mixed-use development achieving its maximum height allowance in CD5 districts. So this is an illustration in Mission Street. We would be allowing that 50-foot setback at the corner to provide enough clearance for vehicles to approach Mission. And then the principal frontage clarification would allow here a 41% build-out scenario on the side street to accommodate for parking in the back, which is our overall goal with parking in these commercial areas. So the requested action is for the Planning Commission to recommend that the City Commission adopts text change 24-01. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Barber-Dykiel. Do any members of the Planning Commission have any questions?
A couple quick ones. The 11-foot isn't that 14 feet?
No, so I double checked that and remember we had that confusion last time. The current requirement, it's 11 feet. The 14-foot is the maximum ceiling requirement for first stories.
Okay. Okay. I guess I don't know what happened with that one property, but they were insisting that the city was insisting on 14-foot ceilings. How did that?
That may be a miscommunication. The requirement was 11 foot, and I do have a letter from the design team saying that they were accommodating the 11-foot ceiling from the frontage.
Okay.
Any further questions? I'll open this up to public comment. Okay, seeing nobody looking to speak, I'll close the public comment and open for discussion.
Nothing online from the apparent lack of interest. Okay.
Do we have a motion on the item?
Well, I'll make a motion, let's see. Make a motion that we approve the requested action, recommend that the city commission adopt text change 24-01.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. The next item on our agenda is public comment. See no one here. Is there anyone online? Okay, our closing public comment. The next item on our agenda is a presentation by Progressive Companies about the Mission Street Improvement Plan, existing conditions, evaluation, and survey results. Ms. Barber-Dykiel, if you would please introduce the item.
Thank you. So I'm going to have Steve switch the screen to Zoom now for the consultants to provide this presentation to you all, but we're here concluding the first milestone for the Mission Street Improvement Plan project. As you know, we hire Progressive Companies in the beginning of the spring semester, and the planning consultants have been analyzing previous plans that regard Mission Street, including the master plan, and Jason's going to talk more about the other plans they looked at, as well as the analysis of the physical conditions of the corridor at this time, any constraints, observations before we get into the design phase. They're also going to be sharing with you the results of our community-wide survey that we closed on May 31st of this year. So very exciting updates to you all, and this is going to be basically the groundwork that we lay out for us to get into a conceptual design phase, which will be the next steps in the next few months. So I'll have Jason share his screen, and if you have any issues, let me know, and I have the PowerPoint here.
I am not able to share my screen. I'm sorry.
Steve, can you make Jason co-host? Should be good now.
Got it.
No? Oh, I think it's coming up.
Sharing the screen.
Yeah.
Does that work? Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
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 I guess you can all hear me all right since you all said yes when I asked that question. Good evening. My name's Jason Ball from Progressive. Really happy to be here with you all. We've given a version of this presentation now. This will be the fourth time. So we presented it to our steering committee that I believe includes a few of you, also to the city commission on Monday night, and this morning to the DDA. So I'll go ahead and walk through this presentation. It is a slightly abbreviated version versus the one you saw at steering committee. I'll get through it in about a half an hour. As I'm talking through it, if you have any questions, I'll pause a couple of times, but if you have any questions, feel free to just speak up and I'll pause. As Manuela mentioned, these are the list of topics we'll run through tonight. Our review of previous plans and studies, analysis of demographic changes, the physical conditions, traffic and crash data, and the result of the surveys, as well as some MDOT modeling. So in terms of previous plans and studies, there's a variety of previous work that's been done on the corridor. Certainly, we're very aware this is not the first time consideration of redevelopment or redesign of the corridor has come up for Mount Pleasant. So, one of the key plans there is the city's master plan. As I'm sure as planning commissioners, you all are very familiar. The plan includes this graphic on the right-hand side of the slide that shows kind of a future vision of conditions in the corridor. One of the things we've heard from the very beginning in this project was how important it was to think about the development of the corridor in phases, and also to really consider feasibility and current constraints. So this graphic, as you all may be familiar, the buildings shown in the darker gray color are existing, and then the sort of brownish tan color and orange are new. So you can see here that this graphic kind of illustrates an entire redevelopment of the corridor. While that may be something that happens in the future, our work is going to focus on looking at phases in terms of how we get from where we are today to some future vision, not just that ending state. We looked through a variety of other plans, including the city's complete streets policy, as well as previous access management plans. Certainly any result that we have as a result of this work will be consistent with the city's adopted complete street policy. This slide is taken from the city's 2008 corridor or access management plan, excuse me. One of the things we wanted to show on this, just to mention, is that while we're doing a new work, most of the concepts that we're going to be talking about, or many of them, are not new. So this shows the corner of Bluegrass or West Campus Drive and Mission Street. There's a gas station, Target, the hotel there. Any of you that were on our walking audit, we walked this portion of the corridor. And this plan notes needs for cross access, closing driveways, and limiting access to the street to try to improve safety, reduce potential conflicts between pedestrians, vehicles, and vehicles making turns. So those are all still really good ideas and need to happen. So by no means are we kind of throwing away this previous work. We're just looking to build upon it and explore how it works in today's context. The next piece of work that we did was looking at demographic changes. And particularly the first thing we were tasked with was exploring the impact of population change and as it relates to decreases in enrollment at CMU. As you see in this slide, and you all are probably very aware, the city of Mount Pleasant's had a decline in population of about 16% since in the period between 2010 and 2020. That translates to a loss of 4,179 people. Or that same period of time, you can see declines in Union Township, Isabella County as a whole. Michigan essentially held steady. While Mount Pleasant lost about 4,200 people, over roughly that same period of time, CMU saw a decline of about 8,800 students at its main campus. And those 8,800 students enrolled at the main campus, assuming they're living in Mount Pleasant, for which many of them do, we'd expect to see a similar kind of decline in population there within the city, and we haven't seen that same drop. So obviously, 4,200 is a lot less than 8,800. And so when we look at that, at change in population across age brackets, so this chart shows brackets of age in 5-year increments. You can see here that between 2011 and 2022, roughly that same time period we're looking at, there was a decline of about 4,000 people in that sort of college age bracket, right? Late teens, early 20s. But during that same period of time, you had an increase of about 1,000 people in what we call kind of the family formation age, the 30 to 45. And then a decline in people in their 50s and an uptick in people in retirement age, 65 to 75. I can't really tell you why this is or what's driving this change, but I think what's important about this is the story around Mount Pleasant over the last several years is not just one of declining student enrollment and then associated decline otherwise. If we were losing students and nothing else was changing, we'd expect the rest of these age brackets to be staying roughly the same over time or maybe declining slightly, and that's not what's happening. So there's something else going on in Mount Pleasant where we're seeing interest from families and folks of retirement age to move to the community and be there versus just a decline in student population. And then also look at income distribution. Mount Pleasant is typically classified as a low-income community. You can see here, as of the 2021, most recent data from the 2021 census, about 30% of your population earns less, or your household, excuse me, earn less than $20,000 a year. However, within that number are all of your students. And so per the census, there are about 4,200 students living in on-campus housing at this time. So if we think about taking out or removing some segment of those students, so let's say 1,000 households in this case, just as a simple thought exercise. So this slide shows what happens if we remove 1,000 of those low-income houses that are earning less than $20,000 a year from the city's income distribution. And you can see then that the city's income distribution looks a lot more like the states as a whole. With the exception of having fewer kind of high-income households, those earning $100,000 a year or more. City staff then working with students from CMU and professors did their own analysis of this based on a different data source called Placer AI that actually uses cell phone data and marketing data to calculate income. And with that, they were able to exclude student households from the overall households, and they came up with a median household income of $61,500 for non-student households. And that's very consistent with the state as a whole. The state of Michigan's median income is about $68,000 for households. We look at employment then. Again, as you all are probably very familiar, Mount Pleasant's a regional employment hub. You have 12,000 people that come into the city for work every day, about 2,100 that live and work in the city, and then 4,500 that go somewhere else for work. But that commuting pattern isn't consistent across all of your industries. In particular, two of your largest industries, educational services and healthcare, have a disproportionate share of commuters versus folks locally there that work in those industries. So this again may be one reason why, as a result of the decline in student enrollment, maybe decline at the university hasn't been felt as significantly within the city, because many of those folks that are involved with the university may not live in Mount Pleasant. They're coming from other places. Lastly, then, when we look at housing, you all may be fairly familiar with this graphic. I believe it's in your master plan. We've had this concept for a long time in Michigan that we've been building a lot of the housing types that are on the far left and right-hand side of this graphic. Lots of detached single-family homes, lots of large apartment buildings, but not much in between. That's certainly true for Michigan. It's not actually true for Mount Pleasant. So this chart shows distribution of housing types, not households, but physical housing types by the number of units in a structure. So in the state of Michigan as a whole, the right-hand side of the slide, a little over 70% of all the housing units in Michigan are single-family detached housing units, right? So one house, yard, driveway, et cetera. In Mount Pleasant, that number is 40%. And you can see here that in that sort of missing middle category, so structures with between 3 and 19 housing units, Mount Pleasant has a really nice share of housing units within those kinds of structures. So this may present an opportunity for the city to think about as you're seeing changes in student enrollment and changes in preference for your population, opportunities to repurpose some of those housing units to be less focused towards students and more focused towards those populations you're seeing come to the city, you know, sort of families as well as retirees. Home values have generally stayed relatively steady compared to the city of Midland, the next closest sort of large city you have there in Mount Pleasant. You can see there that the home value index dropped off a little bit over the last couple of years, but generally it's holding pretty consistent with Midland, which has a very sort of healthy housing market, as healthy as any housing market is right now. Vacancy rates certainly shot up during COVID as a result of, you know, lots of students probably not being at Central, but those vacancy rates have dropped back down to be at the levels they were in 2012. At the same time, rent prices have climbed in Mount Pleasant just like they have everywhere, but your total median rent is still relatively affordable compared to other places in the state and other larger cities. Before we move on to the next item, any questions about that demographic analysis or comments, things we want to discuss? Hearing none, I'll go ahead and keep going. The next section then is just a summary of our walking audit and analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges within the corridor. We did this a couple months back. We walked 2 segments of the corridor with a variety of stakeholders, including elected and appointed officials, city staff, members of the disability network, local business owners, folks from the DDA. And when we did that, we used a series of walking audits produced by AARP. An example of one of those is on the right-hand side of the slide. And so we looked at 3 things: the quality of streets and crossings, sidewalks, and overall safety and appeal. And so the northern section of the corridor, we walked up to Pickard, 1 mile, and then south to Campus Drive or Bluegrass, again, 1 mile. So the overall corridor is 3 miles, and we essentially walked the 2 miles on each end, the northern and southern ends of the corridor. And you can see that in terms of safety and appeal, the responses are relatively similar. Overall, more negative responses in terms of safety and appeal of those 2 sections than positive. But then we had some divergence. So sidewalks in the northern section of the corridor, overall in terms of the quality of the sidewalk itself, not necessarily how pleasant it is to walk, but the actual physical quality of the sidewalk is pretty good. And the sidewalks are consistent and they don't have a lot of issues of sort of disjointedness or gaps. That's not necessarily true in the southern portion of the corridor. Sidewalks in the southern portion have some gaps. There's some parking lots where they kind of get lost. And there's some areas where they're in pretty serious disrepair. Then we look at streets and crossings. In the southern portions, the places where we have streets and crossings are in much better shape than in the northern portions. Those intersections, the southern portion, there aren't many of them, but they've been redone relatively recently. They're signalized, they're well marked. Whereas in the northern portion of the corridor, a lot of those crossings aren't well marked and aren't signalized for pedestrians. Once we finished our audit, we came back to the room you all are sitting in right now, and we did an analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges with the group. And as a result of that, the most common topic that came up by far was safety. Whether it was mentioned in a good way or a bad way, That was the issue that came up most frequently. It wasn't even close, as you can see. The next most common issues that came up were issues around accessibility, opportunities for redevelopment, and then traffic. And so this table kind of aligns our strengths and weaknesses. When we talk about strengths and weaknesses, we're talking about current conditions today. And you can see how these things relate to one another, right? So we have a strength in that there's good access to the corridor, and it's located well. That being said, while we have good vehicle access, pedestrian access, and bicycle access are a challenge. Traffic volume was seen as a strength. It provides economic opportunity, customers for businesses. The other side of that coin, obviously, is you have challenges navigating the corridor, crossing the street, making left turns. Diversity of businesses in a business-friendly environment, but we've got a lot of driveways and sort of a history of development that really prioritize access for businesses versus overall safety of the corridor. When we look at opportunities and challenges, so looking out in the future, what do we see? We see opportunities around improving safety and access, but with the understanding that we really have to figure out how to balance wanting to maintain access and maintain the corridor as being kind of that primary arterial through the city, so that we don't lose out on some of that economic opportunity that's produced. Lots of opportunities for redevelopment and placemaking, but we have some pretty significant physical constraints. We have a right-of-way that changes quite a bit in terms of its overall width. In some areas of the corridor, we have just 70 feet to work with, and in others, we have 130 feet. And then we have lots of opportunities to close driveways and improve access, but there are some costs associated with that. Opportunities as well to improve landscaping and lighting, and then looking to the future in terms of potential technology when it relates to autonomous vehicles or new pedestrian signals to improve safety. Some other challenges that were identified, again, thinking about what that population change looks like in the future. I don't know that any of us have a crystal ball there in terms of what enrollment will look like at the university, but certainly thinking that change will impact any decisions we make in the corridor. Coming to general consensus on solutions, and then the state of the current zoning ordinance. Several of those challenges, I believe you all just made recommendations to address, or at least start to really significantly chip away at tonight, which is excellent. So next, look at the corridor's physical conditions. We've already talked about most of this, so I'll go through it pretty quick. But in general, like we mentioned, sidewalk characteristics vary in different parts of the corridor. The picture here is in our southern part of the corridor. You can see the sidewalk there just kind of ends in a parking lot with a car parked in front of it. Accessibility is a challenge for anybody that's not walking, or even folks that are walking, whether you're in a wheelchair or a stroller. Anybody with mobility challenges is difficult. Generally, new developments that has come in the last 5 to 10 years do a much better job of providing pedestrian access to the street, and also limiting access in driveways than older sort of legacy developments where that wasn't a priority. That being said, most of your businesses are well maintained, demonstrate investment. You've got relatively low vacancy rates still. There's lots of opportunities then to add landscaping and look at opportunities to sort of do basic aesthetic improvements in relatively low cost kind of tactical ways that we'll be exploring. So this just illustrates our existing right-of-way. This varies, as I mentioned, this is sort of a generalized version of it, but we actually have 4 different right-of-ways throughout the corridor, or right-of-way widths. So generally, we look at Bluegrass to Preston, we're 100 feet plus. And then between Preston and Pictured, we're between 80 feet to 70 feet in terms of available right-of-way. Bluegrass to Preston, when you get outside of the sidewalk, generally we don't have buildings close to the street. Everything's set way back. We've got parking lots or other sort of landscaping, grass in between the sidewalk and destinations. Whereas the northern portion of the corridor, as we get north of Preston, we've got buildings much closer to the street. Maybe not at the sidewalk, but we're in relatively easy walking distance. We look at then traffic and crash data. This chart shows overall vehicle or average daily traffic volumes in the corridor dating back to around 2001, 2002. You can see then traffic volumes were about 35,000 cars a day To today, we're down to about 21,000. There's been some fluctuations there, but in general, we've seen a trend of declining values over that time. And then volumes vary along the corridor, with higher volumes south of High Street and lower volumes as you go further to the north. This slide shows the locations of traffic accidents along the corridor or crashes. As you can see here, the crash frequency is the highest at the southern end of the corridor, concentrated on the intersection at Broomfield. Generally, severe crashes were located at that intersection, including a fatal crash with a pedestrian earlier this year, and then closer to Broadway. You see overall in the period we studied, or that data is available for 5 years from 2018 to 2022, there are over 1,000 crashes in our 3-mile corridor. As part of that, though, as we're thinking about designing for the corridor, what's important is that we're going to pay extra attention to crashes or impacts on what we call vulnerable road users, which are essentially anyone that doesn't have the protection of a car around them. And so while pedestrians and bicyclists were involved in just 2% of crashes, they were a part of 33% of the crashes that resulted in a severe injury. This is common sense, right? If you're in a crash with a car and you're on a bike, or you're walking, the chances you get hurt go way up compared to being in a car with airbags and modern safety improvements. So as we're thinking about designing the corridor and addressing that safety issue, we're really going to be thinking about not just how do we provide for vehicles, but also how do we ensure that we're protecting those vulnerable road users to make the corridor safer and reduce those serious injury crashes. We then performed what's called a crash rate analysis. This essentially just compares the Mission Street corridor to other corridors in the city to show, how it stacks up in terms of its crash rate and severe crash rate. So our corridor is about 3 miles long. We compared that to other corridors, Pickard Street, which is somewhat similar in terms of its context. US 127 just to the east, which is obviously a limited access highway. And then Broad Street and Main Street, two of your main streets in your downtown. And as you can see here, the severe crash rate and the crash rate for both Mission and Pickard is much higher than for those other streets. This is a common theme across all roadways in Michigan and really across the country. Roads like Mission that try to balance both access and speed are much less safe than roads like 127, where you have basically no access. You're just through in speed, versus downtown, where you're not considered about speed or getting through. You're providing access to places. And so roads like Mission and Pickard, where we're trying to do both, are those that have the most severe results in terms of safety and crashes. And so as we're going through this process, we'll be looking at ways to better strike that balance, to improve safety and improve opportunities for economic development and growth. As you all are familiar, MDOT's done quite a bit of work and analysis on this stretch of road over time. In 2008, MDOT proposed a pretty substantial change to the corridor that included really large medians and also had requirements for really expanding the overall right-of-way to allow for truck turning movements. That proposed change ultimately was rejected by the city. And so as part of that, that's driven lots of the discussions we're having now. One of the important aspects of this today is that there's been a growing acceptance and flexibility at MDOT for different kinds of design standards that allow us to think much more kind of creatively and don't require such huge amounts of right-of-way that prioritizes truck turning movements in the way that the 2008 designs did. I'll also say that in our experience working with your local MDOT TSC rep, they feel very willing to explore good options and solutions versus what we experience in other places. So we're very encouraged by that. MDOT earlier this year, I believe many of you were a part of this presentation, performed some modeling to understand the change in vehicle operations based on different roadway configurations. So they looked at impacts of adding a median like the one shown in the picture above. based on a scenario where we have sort of very gradual increases in traffic volumes over time. And you can see that by adding the median or boulevard concept, overall vehicle delay in the corridor is much less than it would be with the current condition, and congestion goes down. So efficiency is better. You're able to travel from one end of the corridor to the other in less time than if we were maintaining the current condition. So lastly, then, our summary or survey results. We had spectacular response to the survey with almost 1,500 total responses. About 70% of those are Mount Pleasant residents. 16% were visitors to Mission Street, 14% identified as students at Central Michigan, and then the remainder were employees of businesses on Mission Street. Not unsurprisingly, almost all of our responses, 98%, use a car today to get around Mission Street. About 20% of people also walk, and then about 10% also bicycle or scooter. But almost everybody uses a car as their primary means of transportation, or at least it's some of the time. When we ask people what mode of transportation they'd like to use, though, only about 60% said they prefer to only use their car. So we see that a pretty significant percentage of those 1,500 people that respond, would like to have other options. And you can see there that they're essentially split between walking, biking, and then with a little less interest, but still some interest in opportunities for public transit. So certainly everybody uses a car today because, frankly, that's the safest and best way to access the corridor. But we have pretty significant interest in other options for transportation. When we ask people about how they feel about safety and access along Mission today, about 50% were very unsatisfied or unsatisfied with getting into and out of destinations along Mission Street, compared to about 30% that were satisfied. So generally, people don't feel great about getting around on Mission Street. This is probably not news to any of you. And then about 40% feel unsafe when traveling Mission Street on the road, with about the same number that feel unsafe traveling Mission Street on the sidewalk. About the same number of folks, just a little less, 37%, feel safe traveling on the road. Significantly fewer, just 27% feel safe traveling on the sidewalk. We also asked folks, what's one word to describe the current state of Mission Street today? Excuse me. And the most common response by far was busy, followed by chaotic. You can see the other responses here as well. Not all of them are negative, right? We have some responses like businesses and adequate, and opportunities were fine and good. So it's not all negative, right? But overall, the feeling is that Mission Street's busy, it's crowded, and there's challenges there in terms of getting around and getting to places you want to be. When we ask people to describe their ideal future state of the corridor, our word safety comes up again by far as the #1 priority, followed by concepts like organized, pleasant, convenient, inviting, attractive, walkable, still busy. So I don't think anybody's proposing that we reduce traffic volumes or remove businesses from Mission Street, just thinking about how to make it a more pleasant environment that works for everybody there equally. So overall, as we've been wrapping up this work and analysis of the corridor, analyzing survey results, we have 6 kind of emerging themes. The first is that safety is the #1 priority. So really think about how to make the corridor more safe. It's critical. As I mentioned, MDOT's a really willing and collaborative partner. We can't overemphasize how important that is. Third, there's a strong desire for improvement, but we understand the importance of balance. So we have some aspirational visions for the future, but those really have to be balanced with our reality today and the constraints that we're working with them. There are opportunities to improve both the corridor, but also the land uses around it. But those really vary, if not block by block, certainly within different segments of the corridor as we travel north to south. And so as we're going through this work on the corridor, we're going to be taking a very nuanced approach to looking at how we redesign and develop that corridor that that isn't just a sort of one size fits all or two size fits all for that corridor, but thinking about how it works in a much more sort of finer grained viewpoint. Enhancing destinations is critical. So not just getting through the corridor, but getting to places and getting across the corridor. You have really important destinations both to the east and the west of Mission Street, whether it's downtown or the high school or the hospital, residential neighborhoods. And so not just thinking about those connections up and down the corridor, but across. And then lastly, you all have the policy tools and opportunities to make significant changes, but it's going to take a sort of phased approach. So you all took one of those first steps tonight by recommending those changes to the zoning ordinance to provide some flexibility for economic opportunity in the corridor. The DDA, the Mission Picker DDA, has also adopted a matching program to allow business owners to close driveways. Both of those are fantastic steps towards moving in the right direction. And we'll continue to work with Manuela and the team there to identify those opportunities and point them out. Because you don't have to wait till we're done with this, the next 5 to 6 months to go ahead and get started on some of these low-hanging fruit. And we think it's great that you all have done that already, and we couldn't be more supportive of that. So in terms of next steps, we're working through conceptual designs and policy options this summer with staff and MDOT. And then in September, we'll be holding a public input and education event to present some of those options to the public. And get feedback on those before we work through kind of a final plan and design solutions to go back to MDOT. Ultimately, all of this will be adopted as an amendment to the city's master plan. So again, it's been a really great process so far. I think for all of us at Progressive, we've really enjoyed working with local officials, staff, your stakeholders there in the city. And we feel really good about the direction we're headed in on this project. So I'm happy to answer any questions or discuss anything you'd like on the project so far.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Anyone on the Planning Commission have any questions?
I do have hopefully a quick question. You say about 2000-ish, there was 35,000-ish cars per day on Mission?
Correct. That's average daily traffic volume. Give me a minute here. I'll go back to that slide.
Well, that just leads into the actual question. Were there more accidents back then or less?
Good question. I can't answer that. I will ask and see if that historical crash data is available back that far. I don't know.
One would expect roughly double the incidents with that much traffic flow. I'm just kind of curious to know if we have more crashes with fewer cars or what's going on there. It may not have any relevance to anything, but I would like to know it.
Yeah, so I will say generally, and I'm not a transportation engineer, but generally congestion does not make for more crashes. And sometimes it actually decreases crashes because you have to slow down and pay more attention. So you all might remember that during COVID, there were way fewer people on the roads, but crash rates didn't really drop. So that some of that same dynamic may have happened here. I can
sure. Yeah, with a road that's not clogged with cars, you get some Mad Max syndrome going on there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of traffic is kind of psychology, right? And so I don't know that that relationship isn't what you would expect it to be. I'll say that. But we'll look. I don't know that I have the answer for that, but we'll see if we can find it.
And do we know when the state bumped, if I recall correctly, the state moved the speed limit from 30 or 35 to 45, maybe 10 years ago? Do we know when that happened?
I can find out.
Okay, because there may be a correlation with traffic incidents and that speed limit change. All right, thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Any more questions? Great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very much.
The next item on our agenda is the staff report.
All right, so Steve, I'll need you to change to the podium laptop again. And I just have a few projects that we approved administratively in the past month. So first is 3709 South Isabella Road. So it's Aetna Supply Company. They applied to add a new asphalt area, restriping of the parking lot, new dumpster and gravel replacement for their current site. So you can see here the site plan that got approved. They're also going to have a new structure in the back for storage of materials that's going to be kind of like a canvas type of structure. Staff also approved 1723 South Mission. So this is a proposal for using an existing space for a Starbucks. They're going to be using the existing drive-through configuration there. They are able to still accommodate 10 cars per required by the zoning ordinance. And they provided a new dumpster on site. Currently, the mall shares a large dumpster on the kind of south end of the mall, but they decided to create a new space for their use here on the kind of top left corner, highlighted in red. They're also doing some small changes to facade materials, signage, windows, and fence. And then the last project is a follow-up from our previous meeting in June, which we had a special use permit for 1004 South University. They are converting the 3-unit building into a 4-unit building, and one of the conditions was that they applied for a site plan to add new trees on the premises according to the zoning ordinance, and an additional road car to make sure that they don't have waste being, spilled out of the current capacity there. So those are the 3 projects, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. At this time, there's no further business, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes.
When did you move them up?